The docks were a constant hum of activity, heavy machinery grinding, workers shouting, the slap of waves against the hulls of ships. But amidst the chaos, one figure seemed out of place. He wasn't a dock worker. He didn't wear the grime-streaked overalls or the weathered caps that were the uniform of the men around him. He was clean-shaven, his suit a shade too formal for the laboring men milling about. Yet, in the midst of this cacophony, he blended perfectly. There was nothing extraordinary about him. His face was unremarkable, his posture almost rehearsed in its casualness. Yet, it was the absence of any distinguishing feature that set him apart. He wasn't a stranger to the dock workers. Not exactly. But to each man, he was more a vague memory than a reality. In their eyes, he wasn't visible, and that in itself was his greatest asset. His name was not important, though no one had ever known it. His identity was nothing more than a shadow, an image without form, a ghost. But he carried a briefcase, tucked under his arm, as if it were nothing more than a simple accessory. Inside, there were papers, orders, messages, commands, vital information, the kind that could shift the tide of a war if it ever made it to the right person. His task was one of immense importance, though no one would ever know it. He was a messenger, an invisible one, whose life was about to take a dangerous turn. The war was already raging, and secrecy had become the most valuable currency. In 1942, the world was divided, not just by geography or ideologies, but by an unseen war of whispers and shadows. Every piece of intelligence mattered, every word, every coded message. There was no room for mistakes, no tolerance for the faintest trace of error. The stakes had never been higher, but amidst the chaos of war, some stories would remain untold. This man, whose face had never been seen by anyone of importance, was among the few who had the courage, or the madness, to navigate through the smoke and mirrors of war. His skills were unparalleled, but they were never spoken of. He was a figure whose role was purely functional, and yet it was vital. He was a courier, but not in the traditional sense. He wasn't a man who delivered letters between generals or soldiers. No, his work was far more covert, far more dangerous. He carried not just words, but the essence of espionage itself. He had been recruited by the British intelligence service almost by accident. His linguistic talents had caught the eye of someone who recognized the value in a man who could slip unnoticed between enemy lines. But it wasn't just his ability to speak 5 languages that made him valuable. It was his unassuming nature, his complete lack of presence in any given room. He could vanish, become invisible, like the smoke that rose from the many factories of Liverpool, dissipating without leaving a trace. And that, in the eyes of his handlers, made him invaluable. The world of espionage wasn't one that welcomed outsiders, and yet he had become a part of it. A reluctant part, perhaps. He had never asked for this life. He had never desired to be a part of the war machine, but the war had no room for choice. It was a force that swept everything in its path, and this man, whose name would never be remembered, had been swept into its current. But unlike most of the men who had been conscripted into service, he had no illusions about the cost of his role. There was no honor in his work. There would be no medals or parades at the end of it. His service was one of quiet deception and absolute secrecy. The very nature of his task meant that his contributions would go unrecognized, and that was the way he liked it. He was the perfect messenger for the war, unseen, unheard, unnoticed. It was only when he was required to act that he became relevant. He carried with him orders, commands, messages from one country to another, from one side of the war to the other. Sometimes, the messages were simple, just a few words that could change the course of an operation. Other times, they were more complex, filled with details and secrets that could spell disaster if they fell into the wrong hands. On this particular day, as he walked through the Liverpool docks, he was carrying a message so vital that its success was crucial to the war effort. He had spent weeks preparing for this delivery, memorizing every detail of the message, every detail of his movements. No one knew the full extent of what he was doing or why he was doing it, and that was the way it had to be. His face was unknown to all, his name unspoken. He was a messenger, and that was all. He approached a nondescript building at the edge of the docks, its walls lined with rusted metal and fading paint. It was a place where no questions were asked, where people came and went, their motives known only to themselves. The man entered quietly, without attracting attention. He knew the importance of blending in. Every step, every glance, every breath had to be calculated, deliberate. To make himself known was to risk everything. Inside the building, a small group of men waited. They were familiar faces, faces he had seen before, but never close enough to know. There was no need for introductions. The men took his briefcase, and in return, handed him a new one. The exchange was swift, almost clinical, but the weight of what had just transpired was immense. The briefcase was now a symbol of something far greater than any of the men present could understand. It was a symbol of trust, of espionage, of a war fought not on battlefields, but in the spaces between nations, between ideologies, between lives. The man turned and left the building without a word. His role was complete for now, but his work was far from over. He would continue to carry the messages, the whispers of war, from one place to another. And though he would never be recognized, never be thanked, he would remain a vital part of the war effort. His contribution would go unnoticed, but it would not go unimportant. For in the world of espionage, there was no room for recognition. There was only the mission. As he walked back into the bustling chaos of the docks, he felt the familiar weight of the briefcase against his side. It was a weight that had become a constant presence in his life, a weight that had come to define him. The war was a force that consumed everything in its path, and he, like so many others, was simply a cog in its machine. But that was the nature of war. It didn't care who you were or what you had done. It only cared about the outcome. And for this man, the invisible courier, there would be no glory, no recognition, no medal. He would disappear into the fog of history, just as he had disappeared into the crowd on the docks of Liverpool. But his work, his unseen, unsung labor, would continue to echo in the shadows of the war until its final days. In the end, he would become one of the many forgotten men of the war, heroes whose names would never be written down, whose stories would never be told. But for now, there was only the briefcase, only the next message, the next delivery. And as the man vanished back into the sea of humanity, he disappeared just as he had arrived, unseen, unnoticed, and entirely indispensable. The city of light was cloaked in the darkened shadow of war. The cafes that once served as vibrant hubs of conversation and flirtation had turned into hushed, subdued places filled with people who spoke only in careful whispers. Outside, the streets of Paris were patrolled by soldiers who, though no more than human, wore the heavy weight of power with an almost mechanical precision. The world had changed since the war began, and nothing was as it had been. Even the buildings seemed to carry a heaviness now, their once beautiful facades weathered by the constant storm of war. And yet, amidst this bleak backdrop, life still flickered in strange, hidden places. There was a cafe, tucked away on a narrow side street, just off the Boulevard Saint-Germain. Its windows were always steamy, its tables always full, but none of its patrons would have dared to speak loudly. The air inside was thick with tension. The patrons were not just ordinary Parisians, but a mix of resistance fighters, smugglers, and those who had chosen to defy the occupying forces. Among them sat a man, an unremarkable figure who blended seamlessly into the background, just as he had been trained to do. The man who had once been a shadow in Liverpool, and who had carried vital messages across war-torn Europe, now found himself in this cafe. His mission just as important, but the stakes even higher. He was here to meet someone, but as always, he could not afford to be seen. His face was neutral, his posture unremarkable. There were no signs of stress or fear in his expression, though internally he was constantly on edge. He had become a master of remaining unnoticed, of walking through life as a ghost. His job, his life, depended on it. A few tables away, two figures sat hunched over a map, their conversation a low murmur. It It was difficult to tell at first glance whether they were spies or ordinary citizens caught in the tides of war. But they were neither. They were part of the resistance, part of a hidden network that fought back against the crushing weight of the German occupation. They were waiting for him, and they knew exactly who he was. He was the Courier, the invisible man who had delivered countless messages to those in the underground, often at great personal risk, yet never receiving any recognition. His work was a silent one, but without him, the network would be lost. The Courier's eyes flicked to the door as a new figure entered, a young woman with a tense air about her, scanning the room as if she were hunting for something. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the entire cafe seemed to pause. The moment passed as quickly as it came, and the woman took a seat, never acknowledging his presence. She was one of the few people who knew what he truly did, though like everyone else, she would never know his name. The Courier's work in Paris was different from what it had been in England. There was something far more dangerous about these meetings, the shadow of the German soldiers hanging over every transaction, every interaction. The streets might have been crowded with people, but the fear was palpable. The French were living under the yoke of occupation, and even the smallest mistake could cost lives. The resistance knew this, and so did the Courier. Every meeting, every message, every step he took could be the one that got him caught. And if that happened, there would be no one to save him. He was just one man, after all, and no one would care. Yet in these quiet moments of invisibility, in the flicker of shadows, he found something that others could not: freedom. Freedom in his ability to move unseen. Freedom in his anonymity. The war had stolen everything from most people, from entire nations. But for this man, the very thing that kept him invisible, kept him safe, also made him invaluable. The conversation at the table grew louder, a few words breaking through the murmur of background noise. The young woman was speaking now, her French sharp, punctuated with a distinct accent. It was a language the Courier knew well. He had spent countless hours perfecting the languages of those around him, the nuances of each dialect, the weight of every word. It wasn't just about speaking 5 languages. It was about understanding the power each word held. And in this moment, the woman's words were laden with something that the Courier could feel: urgency. He didn't need to hear it all. The atmosphere told him everything. The resistance had a plan, and this plan could change everything. But the only way to make it work was to get a message across. A message to the Allies. A message that could not afford to be intercepted. And so, he listened, as much as he could without drawing attention to himself. His training had taught him how to be still, how to watch, how to listen. It was all part of the same game, an invisible game that no one else could understand. In the world of espionage, there were no second chances. Every message had to be perfect, every movement calculated. When the conversation ended, the young woman gave the Courier a nod, signaling that it was time. She rose from her seat, as calmly as if nothing had changed. The Courier remained seated for a moment longer, letting the tension of the cafe surround him, letting the weight of the moment settle in his chest. There would be no turning back now. The meeting had been brief, but it had been crucial. The message that had passed between them was far more important than any of the other messages he had carried. It was a message of life and death, a message of hope and despair. The resistance was preparing for a major operation, and the timing had to be perfect. The Allies needed to know when and where it would happen. But getting the message across was only half of the battle. The real challenge would be ensuring that it reached the right people, and that no one knew who had sent it. The Courier finished his coffee, paid the tab, and left the cafe as quietly as he had entered. The moment his feet hit the street, he felt the familiar sense of unease settle in. Paris was a city of beauty, of culture, of art. But it was also a city at war, a city where any mistake could mean your life. He moved swiftly, blending into the crowd, walking with purpose but never looking back. As he made his way through the maze of narrow streets, his thoughts raced. The message had been delivered, but there was still much to do. He had to get to the rendezvous point, to pass the message to the next contact, to keep the chain of communication intact. Each step was a risk. Each breath could be his last. But this was his life now. This was his purpose. The streets of Paris, though packed with people, felt eerily empty. The soldiers patrolling the area, their boots echoing on the cobblestones, were a reminder of how fragile his world was. It would only take one slip, one wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. He had to move carefully, stay focused, and never let his guard down. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the alley where the next contact would be waiting. It was a nondescript place, tucked behind a row of shops that had long since closed for the day. The alley was dimly lit, the shadows long and shifting, as if they were alive. He paused for a moment, scanning the area, his heart racing in his chest. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the contact, a man he had worked with before. There was no need for words. The courier handed over the briefcase, and in return, he received another. The exchange was quick, the message now safely on its way to the next person in the chain. Without a word, the courier turned and walked back into the night. His role in this intricate game was far from over. He would continue to carry the messages, to be the invisible hand that connected people, that connected resistance movements across Europe. And though he would never be thanked, never be recognized, he would keep going because there was no other choice. The war was far from over, and for this invisible man, the fight would continue. His name would never be known. His face would never be remembered. But his role in the war, the role of the invisible courier, was one that could never be erased. The war was drawing to a close, but the streets of London still bore the scars of the past years. The city had been bombed, rebuilt, and bombed again. Yet, in the midst of its constant state of reconstruction, life had managed to keep moving. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and smoldering ashes. People walked with purpose, but their eyes were distant, their faces etched with the weariness of years spent under siege. The war had consumed them all, soldiers and civilians alike, and the end, though in sight, was still a distant horizon. In the heart of the city, a man walked through the damp streets, his coat pulled tightly around his shoulders against the London chill. He had no destination in mind, no reason to be anywhere. He was a figure who had once been a ghost, a mere presence in the shadows. But now, after so many years, he had grown tired of being invisible. He had become a part of the war, a part of the machinery that ran behind the scenes, unnoticed and unappreciated. The work he had done had shaped the course of history, but no one knew his name. No one knew what he had sacrificed, what he had endured. This man, like so many others, had played a role in the grand tapestry of the war. His contributions had been crucial, but like all those who had fought in the shadows, he was destined to be forgotten. The invisible couriers, the spies, the informants. These are the men and women whose efforts were vital to the war, yet whose names would never be written down. Their actions were buried beneath the weight of history, forgotten by all but a few.